Well-known digital safety stories and travels the country speaking at safety days on her story, lessons learned and industry support post-crash. Krista still works full-time as an ER nurse, and she spends her spare time posing with Fabio in local grocery stores. She has the picture proof. So anyway, help me welcome all the way from Seattle, Krista Haugen. Okay, that's a funny story, and I'll tell you if we have time. You don't run into Fabio every day. Just to say his name cracks me up. Anyway, like Stacy said, I'm Krista Haugen, and I certainly don't profess to be an expert in safety or much of anything other than my own experiences, but I have had quite a few unique experiences, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here to share them with you today. And I thank Stacy and the Indiana Ames Committee and everybody that put this together, because I know it's a lot of work. So we've talked a lot about accidents and safety and risk, but what I'm going to kind of focus on today is you, the people. And that's kind of a daunting subject, because as willing as we are to kind of rush into other people's chaos and other people's trauma, I think we're a little bit reluctant to look at our own morbidity and mortality. So I know this is a difficult subject, and it's probably going to be a little bit uncomfortable. If you feel like you want to take a break and walk out and take a breath, I totally understand, so feel free to do that. So this is the ADAMS database, and it shows where all the aeromedical bases are in the United States. And part of the reason I show this is because, well, there's a lot. And secondarily, they kind of look like they're all in little bubbles. And I think that it's human nature to sort of exist in your own little bubble. And I just want to commend you on creating this day, because it breaks you out of your bubble and exposes you to best practices from other regions. And there's a lot of different programs that are putting on regional safety days now. I know that Airlight Denver does. I've been to Airlight Georgia. The Northeast Air Alliance has a wonderful, regional safety day, so that you get to know your neighboring programs, and it becomes less about competition and more about, collegiality. Because when it comes to safety and survivorship, really, competition be damned. Those things are not proprietary. And really, as far as the general public is concerned, don't you think that they see a helicopter as a helicopter as a helicopter, and they don't really distinguish between programs, and they really don't distinguish between operators. And so when a helicopter crashes, it impacts all of us. It's not just one program. So I'm here today to bring you the perspective of myself, and then also all of the different accident survivors and family survivors that I've really had the pleasure of meeting over the last few years. And what I'd like to get away from is this scenario right here, because this is something that a lot of accident survivors ran into post-accident when they came back to their program to discuss what went right and what went wrong. And really, a major part of this is CRM, which Randy's going to talk about. And I would suggest to you that you take CRM and employ the techniques that he brings, not only in the cockpit, but also within the organization, and then also within the industry as a whole. How do all those bubbles across the map communicate so that if an accident happens in one region of the country, it's not going to happen again. The same accident isn't going to happen again in another part of the country. So I think, when the general public looks at helicopters, they see, okay, there's a helicopter, you see it on the news, patient was airlifted, blah, 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 and they just see the what. And really, it's about the who. There's a lot of complex processes going on in these aircraft. And, a lot of that is going on in the cockpit, and a lot of it's going on in the back of the aircraft. And I think that the complexity of this work is really oftentimes underestimated. Both what's going on in the cockpit and in the back. And then, in the back, if you're comfortable with your skills, you have the education, the support, the training to perform the clinical skills, and you can also do that with even a higher level of compassion. Because you're not so worried and focused, do I know how to do this, do I get this? You've got it, and then you can expend that energy being compassionate with your patients. All of this takes place under some sort of organizational umbrella, an organizational culture, which hopefully includes some sort of safety management system, and hopefully exists in a just culture. But I would suggest that there's something missing from that picture, and I'm going to come back to it at the end. And in the end, we talk about accidents, but what it's really about is the people, you. and your people, your families. We want to keep you safe. We want you to go home. And we sort of take a cursory look at these accidents. And I'm telling you from personal experience and having met so many survivors and so many surviving family members that there is so much more to the story and so much information that has been essentially untapped. So my story begins in Kalispell, Montana. I actually had no intention of becoming a nurse ever. In fact, when I went to college, I took a class called Imagine Your Future in Nursing, and I was like, no way, I do not want to do this. And somehow, here I am 23 years later, a long nursing career that's been exclusively emergency, critical care, and then aeromedical transport. This is the alert helicopter in Kalispell, Montana. And, I would see this. I went to high school there, and I would see it flying around. I was like, oh, that's cool. I'm sure they do amazing work. And once I became a nurse, I was like, okay, that's what I would like to do. So I went straight into the emergency department, and then I went up to the trauma center, worked in the level 1 emergency department, and I went to the burn ICU, which had overflow from medical, neuro, cardiac, and trauma, and also it was connected to the peds ICU. And so we also did pediatric burns, which I'm pretty sure I took about 10 years off my life because that's one of the most emotionally distressing places I think you can work. So I was up in the burn unit, and a job became available at North Northwest, and somebody said, are you going to apply for it? And I was like, oh, yeah, I'll give it a shot. So I did, and I actually got hired. And so Airlift Northwest, it's really interesting to me because when I look at that Adams database, there's so many programs out here and so much competition. We had essentially no competition. So that whole sort of factor was eliminated from our picture. So we operated at the time Houston Mark IIs, and we had 4 helicopters. We had Lear 35, the turboprop, and we had 4 rotary bases, a fixed wing base in central Washington, and then a fixed wing base up in Alaska. So it was a pretty busy program. We did probably 3,500, 4,000 flights a year. We flew in a nurse-nurse configuration, so pediatric nurse and adult nurse, and so theoretically we could cover the gamut of the age spectrum of illnesses and injuries. And we probably at the time did almost half and half, or maybe 60-40 interfacility to scene calls. And so here's a severe, clear, bright, sunshiny day in Seattle, which is sort of a rarity, but it does happen, and it is one of the most beautiful places you can imagine to fly. There's the water, there's the mountains, the city is beautiful. I remember coming back on a flight towards Seattle from Port Angeles, and there was a cloud layer, and you can see the tops of the buildings sticking up through the clouds, and I'm like, this is truly like the Emerald City. It's just absolutely stunning. I like this picture because it kind of sums up the way our crew was. I was privileged to work with some just stellar clinicians, with fabulous personalities, really fun to work with. And, I think that the kinds of people that are drawn to this work are those types of people. You're motivated, you're passionate, you're excellent at what you do, and you want to do this work. And it was really a privilege working with them. We had a very proactive safety program at the time. And when I first started Airlift, they had a fatal crash in 1995. And I worked at a local ER. I knew some of the flight crews, so I came to the memorial service to support them. And what struck me was, the profound depth of their grief and their loss, because the bonds that were created, between these flight crews, as you know, are very powerful. As you're up against the gates of hell with these people, and you form very strong bonds, and you spend a lot of time together. So it was a very well-bonded group of people, and I saw that for the first time when I went to this memorial service because they were devastated. But when I started flying, in my interview, I didn't ask about safety. I didn't know what to ask. I didn't know what it looked like. I was brand new. I was going into it for the medicine, or for the medical part of it, and I didn't even think about the safety piece, but I thought, oh, they had an accident, so they must have fixed things, we must be good to go. I didn't know what I didn't know. So I've been working there about 5 years. We had a very proactive safety committee, and to the point where they were doing water egress training before water egress training really started to hit the forefront of the HEMS industry. So we had all sorts of survival training. We had dry land survival, we had winter survival, and then the water egress training, which was actually one of the most valuable survival training things I've ever seen. We had the survival kit in the back, but we also carried a little mini, I had a mini survival kit on my person. We had, as you can see, the long sleeve Nomex. We had, steel-toed high-top boots, PFDs, helmets, and a good CRM environment. We had a pilot who came and taught us CRM. He was one of our local pilots, and he would actually go to the extent where he'd set up chairs in the conference room, and he'd be like, okay, pilots here in the configuration of the aircraft, and give us a scenario, after the didactic portion, okay. Here's your scenario, you're coming into an undeveloped LZ, hot and heavy, and then he's like, points to one of the crew members and says, you see wires, go, what do you do? And so you'd have to answer with the correct verbiage, the correct tone of voice, and then that way with pilots and crew members training together, everybody's on the same page. So if I say abort, or if I say climb, my pilot knows that I'm serious, and he'll respond accordingly. So it was really, we had good relationships with our crew members, we had good relationships with our pilots. I never ever once flying an aircraft thought that I could not say to my pilot, hey, I'm uncomfortable, what's going on here, or at least be able to ask a question without being like, look, I'm the pilot, hands off type of thing. Really good relationship. And so those are the things that sustain us as we go through this work, which, we're exposed to human suffering and tragedy every single day. And, Dr. Gomez shows these pictures, and it's like, these are the things that we have to deal with. This is for the people that don't do the medical piece of it. This is just a snapshot in time. When you walk into a scenario where somebody has blown his face off, and you're the one responsible for managing that airway, that is a difficult scenario to be in. And then the backstory always compounds it, and then the family members, many of whom the primal screens are all embedded in our brains. It's difficult work to do. But when you have support and you have training and you have the backup that you need, you can do it. I remember working at the trauma center in the ER, and it was slammed. But the crew that was on, everybody had each other's backs, and we thought, even though this is so dreadfully difficult, we can do it because we know we've got each other. Well, the hardest call that we ever got was on September 29th, 2005, and that was that one of our aircraft had gone missing, and they'd been missing for 45 minutes. I think it's one thing to hear, well, it's horrific to hear that one of your aircraft has crashed. It is almost extra horrific to have them missing and not have any kind of an answer. So we waited and waited, and of course the question, who's on board? So they told us who was on board, and we waited, and I was actually out of town, so that made it all the more difficult. And they finally came back and said there was a debris field found in the Puget Sound, and there are no survivors. And so we lost, our adult nurse Erin, pediatric nurse Lois, and our pilot Steve. Backstory: Steve had been in a crash probably 2.5, 3 years earlier. He was going to relocate the helicopter. It was a snowy night. They figured that there had been ice slugs in the intakes, and he had a dual engine flame out and crash, and he was critically injured. So he went to the trauma unit. He was patched back together, decided that he wanted to come back and fly, and was ultimately able to do that. So, and that comes into play later when they're trying to figure out what happened, because they ended up not being able to recover the bulk of the aircraft, and they never recovered Lois's body. And so, these dynamics that come into play with these accidents should compel people. Nobody wants to crash, obviously, and you want to prevent accidents, obviously. But if you only knew the ripple effect and the fallout, which is unique for each accident, it might even compel you to try, even harder. Not to say that you don't now, but if you only knew. Flying over that bay, knowing that Lois's body was still down there somewhere, is disturbing to me to this day. As is the fact that we're never really going to know what happened in this accident. The weather was bad that night, and Steve had been pieced back together, so there are all sorts of theories and all sorts of speculation about, it was weather that took him down, or maybe, Steve, one of his grafts blew or something, but we'll just never know. And I finally, after years, came to grips with the fact that, we're not going to know. And so in situations like that, I think in terms of practice, you have to just sort of pull out the things that could have contributed to the accident and do everything at your program that you can to mitigate all of those different factors. So we had the memorial service. How many here have lost crew members, friends in this? So you've been to the services. How many here have actually been in an incident or accident yourself? So we had the memorial service, which was dreadfully difficult. And one thing in hindsight that I look back, now that I sort of pay attention to all this now, is how differently people respond to grief. And the fact that, that there are very individual responses makes it very hard to develop sort of a set plan as to how to respond. But the bottom line is there has to be a response plan in place in order to help facilitate the grief for people. So we went through the service, saw all those families grieving, and then 3 weeks later was AMTC in Austin. So a handful of us were able to go to AMTC, and this was really before social media really took off. We didn't have Facebook and stuff like that. Seems like the dark ages, doesn't it? So we got to AMTC, and people had heard about the accident, and they offered their condolences, which we really appreciated, but it's very interesting to compare now and then, because now with social media, there's this immense outpouring, which is nice to see. And back then, it wasn't that the outpouring didn't exist, it's just that you didn't hear about it. So we got, very nice, very kind words from people at AMTC, which was comforting. Came back from AMTC on a Thursday. I had scheduled myself to work on a Friday, so you know how that goes. I was kicking myself because obviously I was tired from AMTC. Came back, went to work on that Friday, and found myself knelt next to the wreckage of our helicopter Friday night, assessing my partner's pupils. So this begs the question, how in the world can you have 2 crashes in less than a month? What's going on with this program, right? Well, it's interesting because when you look at the accident statistics, just because a program hasn't had an accident, does that mean they're safe necessarily? I mean, maybe, maybe not. And the example that is in the Just Culture information says, if somebody drives drunk home and makes it home safely, does it mean that they're safe? And I'm not saying that if a program hasn't had an accident that they're not safe, but you can't sort of make a generalization about that. This program has had 4.5 accidents. Does it mean they're unsafe? I don't know. I mean, none of these accidents are really related. And a couple of the accidents we're not even going to know. We don't know exactly what happened. But with this particular accident, we were in the process of transitioning from the Augusta Mark IIs, because they were like 20, 25 years old, to the brand new Augusta Powers. And so, it's sort of speaking for myself, lulled me into a false sense of security, because I'm like, okay, phew, we're getting rid of the old rattle traps, and we're going to, the latest technology. It had all the bells and whistles. It was geared for night vision. We were going towards night vision. So we're like, yes, new technology, that's fantastic. So my pilot was a Vietnam-era pilot. He had nearly 8,000 hours in helicopters. And the call came in to transport a patient from Willapa Harbor, which is on the very southwesternmost coast of Washington. It's a teeny tiny critical access hospital. And we were going for an adult male with a dissecting abdominal aortic aneurysm. This exemplifies what air medical transport is all about. You have a critically ill patient far away from the tertiary care center. And there was definitely need for a helicopter in this case. So we accept the call, we lift, we're flying south towards Willapa Harbor. We get to the hills, kind of midway there, and the weather came down. And so, I was starting to the point where I'm like, that's not looking so good. I didn't have to say anything. My pilot said, this doesn't look good, I'm turning around. So I was like, great, we're all in agreement. So, even though we have this patient in dire straits at this critical access hospital, and we knew that he needed intervention at a tertiary care center in Seattle, the safest thing for us to do was turn around. For the sake of the crew, we had to turn around. It's a hard decision, but it's a no-brainer. your safety comes first, period. So we turned around, we came back to base, and we talked to our dispatcher about finding a rendezvous point where the weather was better, and maybe we could meet them far away. So we decided upon Olympia, Washington, rooftop helipad at St. Peter's Hospital. So the medics ground the patient up, we were at base waiting, and we got dispatched out, they were, whatever it was, 20 minutes out. So we fly to St. Pete's Olympia, land on the rooftop helipad, and get out to go get the patient. So the medics met us up at the top. And so, you've got the medics, you've got the hospital staff that helps you load and waves by and everything. And so it was interesting because I went to assess the patient, and I said, hi, my name's Krista, I'm one of the flight nurses, we're going to take you up to Seattle, and how are you doing? And he goes, pretty good. And I was like, wow, this is the most stable AAA I've ever seen, but I'll take it. So I'm thinking it's going to be a really uneventful flight. We load the patient up. He's rock solid, stable, pink, warm, and dry. No real significant pain at that time, which I'm like, wow, Indicated to the pilot that we were ready to lift. And because of the safety culture that we had pre-established, we had our stuff secured. We had the patient secured, we had ourselves secured, we had all of our gear secured, and I'm grateful for that because unless you've been in a helicopter crash, it's very easy to underestimate the physics. If you're not ready, you're not going to be ready. You think you can hold anything down, you can't. It happens extremely quickly, and if you're not, if your gear's not all tied down, it can definitely become a projectile and do serious bodily harm. We indicated we were ready. The pilot says, okay, we're going to lift. And we lifted, and you're intimately familiar with the noise that the helicopter makes. We get, I don't know how far over the rooftop helipad, and the engine noise went beep as we were losing lift and losing altitude. And by this time, it's 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, so it's dark. I was sitting in the aft-facing seat, and we came down off the helipad, and I could see, I'm looking backwards up at the helipad, and we're going over backwards like this, and I'm thinking, I can't remember how tall this helipad is, and I couldn't figure out how far we had to fall. And of course, the first thing I thought was, I was in utter disbelief, and I thought of Airlift 4, and I thought of Aaron, Lois, and Steve, and their families, and the fact that we'd all just been through this, and how could our program and how could our families possibly go through this again? So we're falling and falling and falling for what seemed like forever. And it's interesting, if you ever have an opportunity to read Jonathan's narrative of his crash, he says that the fact that he lost consciousness, it was bittersweet, but that because he didn't have a memory of the event is probably what allowed him to return to flying. Time stopped for me. And when I remember this accident, I remember it in microseconds in slow motion clips. And I remember feeling optimistic in that as we were falling and as we were ricocheting off the buildings and as the rotor blades were exploding and as the tail came off and as all this massively noisy violence was going on around me, who knows what the right crash position is because you don't know how the helicopter's going to land. So I just tried to make myself really small. I just balled up in the smallest of balls. I brought my shoulders up to try to protect my C-spine. And I just tried to make myself small because, I've taken care of a lot of trauma patients. I know the mechanisms of injury, blunt force, impalement, rapid deceleration, and I was expecting one or all of those things to happen to us. So I remember everything, and I remember thinking, you're okay, you're okay, you're okay, as we're falling, and then there was a moment where I thought, I don't know if we're going to make it out of this. And that really, I think it was at that period of time that the switch just flipped, and I felt nothing. I was emotionally numb, and it's amazing what the mind does to protect the body in a situation like this. So after what seemed like forever, which I'm sure was not even seconds, we impacted the ground. And I think the thing that really saved us was the fact that we ended up in a dirt courtyard. We were probably, I think the helipad is probably a couple, 3 stories up. And then we had lifted beyond the top of the helipad, and the trajectory in the NTSB report from where we lifted to impact is about 65 feet. But we landed in dirt, and I was stunned to know that we were still alive. I had this momentary like, yes. But then I was like, okay, patient, are you okay? And he said, he was really had an interesting affect because he said, yeah. And he was like matter of fact about this plane, he's matter of fact about this helicopter crash, and I'm like, good. And I think that was the last thought I gave him. I could see that my partner was conscious and she was trying to get out of her belts. I was communicating with the pilot. I'm like, we're okay, we're okay. He's like, okay, I'm going to call the comms center. I'm shutting it down. The other thing that we had learned in our safety program was how to shut the helicopter down, how to shut off the fuel lines, disengage the battery, engage the rotor brake, how to egress, where to egress to, how to communicate with comms. And that training was at the forefront of my mind. I didn't have to think about it. It was right there. And even to the point where I thought, when we exit, I guess we don't need to meet at the 12 o'clock position because, we're in a civilized place rather than off in the wilderness somewhere. So in communicating with Ken, he indicated he was going to shut the aircraft down. And one thing I learned in water egress training is that you wait until all the noise stops to get out. And I guarantee you the first thing you want to do is get the hell out of this aircraft. And so finally, the rotor nose stopped. I asked Ken, is it safe to get out? And he said yes. And it's a good thing that we had that training because what a shame to survive the impact, only to be locked in half by the remaining remnant of the rotor blade. So my door, you can see this is my door sitting just behind the pilot seat here, and the door had come open in the accident, and it wasn't open enough to get out, and I couldn't move it. It was jammed. And so we had learned in our safety training that you pull the Velcro strap down and you can push the window out. Well, I don't know if I missed it or if I wasn't told or what, but you have to pull out the weather stripping as well. And I didn't know that. So I pulled the Velcro and I'm like, nothing happened. I'm like, well, I don't have time for this. I'm wearing high-top steel-toed boots for a reason. So I put the boot through the window, only I put it through the little tiny vent in the middle of the window. So if you can imagine, I'm standing in the middle of this wreckage on one leg, kind of crooked, and I put my foot to the vent, and I literally stopped, and I just kind of went, that was stupid, to myself. So I kicked out the four corners and crawled out that way. When I crawled out, I could see that the tail of the aircraft was gone. What was left was smoking. I'm like, And I looked out, and there was a wall of people in a sort of semicircle that the ER staff had come screaming out of the ER. And I noticed that one of them was holding one of those little baby fire extinguishers. And I had these two opposite thoughts. One was, good foresight, that was great thinking. And the other one was, that is so inadequate for this But come to find out, it's not to put out the whole helicopter, it's to create a path out of the flames for people, or to put an individual out if he's on fire. So for example, Billy Wynn from the Eagle Mid crash is exactly what happened. The staff from the nursing home ran out, they had a fire extinguisher, and they were able to extinguish the flames on his body. So, kudos to that security guard for grabbing that fire extinguisher because it would have made a difference had he needed it. So, I said to them, looking at this little fire extinguisher, they needed to call 911. Of course they had. So they set about to getting the patient out. Our pilot got out and assisted them in getting the patient out and taking him into the emergency department. My partner crawled out, and I was kneeling in the dirt outside the aircraft at this point, and she stood up, and she just immediately had a syncopal episode right in the dirt. So then I'm like, is she have a traumatic brain injury, does spinal cord, what's going on? So we logged roller, and it was one of those really, you have surreal moments all the time in emergency and critical care, but that was really a surreal moment where I'm kneeling over my partner, trying to get her to respond to, painful stimuli, checking her pupils, and next to the wreckage of this helicopter. She came around, she had a back injury, she ended up being treated in their trauma room, and the pilot and I were both, we just had soft tissue injuries, and so we were able to walk in and be evaluated. But the thing that really struck me is that I literally was emotionally numb. I felt nothing, And I was standing there and I was thinking to myself, this is pretty unusual for you. This is going to hit you like a ton bricks later, I bet. And that turned out to be an accurate assessment. I called, I made some phone calls to let people know before they heard it on the news. And let me tell you, with the advent of social media, if you think that you're going to be contacted, first by your program, it's not going to happen. I can't tell you how many family members of people that we've lost saw it first on Facebook. And people were like, well, how do we stop that? Unfortunately, I think the expectation is just going to have to change. I don't think there's a system that's fast enough to get ahead of Facebook and social media and Twitter and, the local news. So it's a very difficult way, obviously, to hear about these accidents, but unfortunately, that's our current reality. What would be nice if we could help train our media to cover these things a little more sensitively for the sake of the families. So I went back to flying. I took some time off. I went back to flying. I felt okay. I felt like I was functioning okay. I just wasn't quite right. And I knew I really wasn't quite right, but I wasn't quite sure what to do with it or who to talk to or where to go, because as far as I knew, nobody survived helicopter crashes. And I think it's normal for anybody who goes through a traumatic event, whether it's a terminal diagnosis, a chronic illness, car accident, whatever, people who go through those types of events want to reach out to somebody who's been through it to get some guidance on how to get through it. Well, as far as I knew, there wasn't anybody. Although I had heard of a sole survivor of a crash into the Potomac River in January of that same year. But I didn't know how to get a hold of him. Where were you? I didn't know how to get a hold of him. There wasn't a mechanism in place, and I didn't know if he'd want to be gotten hold of. So I struggled, and I flailed, and this guy did finally fall on my head about 3 months later. So I had a delayed response. I definitely was diagnosed with PTSD. One of the first things that I noticed was sleep disturbance. I either couldn't go to sleep or I'd wake up in the middle of the night. And I'm by nature not an anxious person, and so to have that type of stress and anxiety was extremely foreign to me, and it scared me to death. So then the fear compounds that. So when you really look at incidents and accidents, you're looking at those things on top of your career and all of the things you've seen and all of the people that you've taken care of and the cumulative stress that comes with that. Add an incident or accident on top of it, and it can become very difficult. The other thing that made me know that I needed to reevaluate what I was doing back flying was I violated my own personal policy of not getting irritable with students. We brought a patient into the trauma center, and he needed to be bagged at a higher rate for some reason I can't remember. And the paramedic student was standing there at the head of the bed, and he was just bagging him at a rate of 14. I'm like, no, we need to bag it a little faster. And I was telling him why, and he just wasn't doing it, and I could feel my blood pressure start to rise, and I was like, you know what, this is not me. I knew that I wasn't myself, and I knew that I needed to get some help. So, this is me, but I think this is a lot of us in EMS, and a lot of us in air medical transport. It's like, I'm going to take care of that guy that just blew his face off. I'm going to manage that airway, which is a nightmare, obviously. And then, I'm going to do a quick turn and go take care of this toddler who just got backed over in the driveway by a parent accidentally. And then, put the aircraft, and then I'm going to go talk to their family in the quiet room, which is always, horribly emotionally stressful. And then I'm going to go back and take the next flight, and the next flight, and the next flight, and then I'm going to go home. And I'm going to come back the next day and do it again. Yeah, I got it, no problem. So this was me, hopefully not in the jackass sense, but I probably was kind of a jackass at the time. You get irritable. You're not sleeping, you're stressed, you get irritable, and it's hard for us, I think, as EMS and critical care providers, or police, or military, the people that are supposed to be the rescuers, to say, I think I need a little help. I didn't even know how to utter those words. I'm like, I don't even know what this is. I don't know what's going on. I don't recognize myself. And, it took, friends and family finally to say, look, clearly you're struggling. Why don't you think about getting some professional help? I was like, yes, I'm going to do that. So I got some professional help. I read as much as I possibly could about PTSD, and it is fascinating. I listened to a symposium about the physiology of PTSD, and as a medical, healthcare provider, it made so much sense to me suddenly. There are distinct physiologic processes that go on with PTSD. And it's hard because, you know, the physical manifestations of those are your fight or flight. So when you're feeling like you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, all of a sudden, for no good reason, because there's no saber-toothed tiger, that's hard to contend with. And it impacts your life and your relationships and your work. And there's really not much literature about it in EMS and paramedical people. There is, however, information in the military literature. And there is help, and there are tools, particularly if you intervene early. So we have a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn from the military. We have a lot to learn from the people that do this work if they're willing to come forward and say, yeah, I am struggling with this, and I do need to get some help. So I read as much as I could. I got counseling. And you know, in the literature about PTSD, these are some of the risk factors. And if you look at people that have been in incidents or accidents, or even, you know, people that do this work every day, you know, we're all at risk for PTSD. Not everybody goes on to develop PTSD, but according to some of the literature, everybody has a point where they're just maxed out. And what that point is varies from person to person. So, you know, people in EMS and air medical transport, critical care police work are definitely in arenas where you have to pay attention to your own stress and mental health, because PTSD is hell. And I can actually understand why people with untreated PTSD want to kill themselves. And it's not that I would have done that, but it scared me that I understood why people do. This is something to be taken extremely seriously and mitigated early on, because it is senseless for people to lose their lives these days over untreated PTSD, because there are so many good tools now to help manage it. The key is you have to get the right kind of help. So, you know, we've had critical incident stress debriefings, things like that, and they've kind of gotten a bad name. Some of the meta-analyses that have been done have proven some of them to be more harmful than helpful. I don't know why that is. It might be because of who's doing it, how they're done, that kind of thing. But we finally found a clinical psychologist out of Austin who specializes in PTSD and trauma, not only in those things, but in this population of people. We're different. We're the people that run into the chaos, run into the fire where everybody else is running away. We are managed differently than, you know, the average bear. So the right kind of help is important. The other thing that we found is talking to somebody who's been through what you've been through is extremely helpful. So the combination of having that really solid peer support along with a high-level clinical professional is hopefully the way that we're going to kind of go with all this. So I flailed. I finally decided that I needed to leave flying because I was constantly being re-exposed, and I was hypervigilant, and if people that you're working with don't share your hypervigilance, then it becomes very uncomfortable. And so, you know, I decided that I probably needed to step away, but then I didn't know what to do. Like, I just didn't know what to do. So I lost direction, I lost my sense of purpose. With PTSD, you already have sort of a detachment from people, which was really difficult for me because I'm typically a very attached person. And so it took a lot of work personally. And in the end, it's your own journey. You have to do the work yourself. And people can support you, but you have to be able to dig deep and be able to find your way through it. One of the things that really helped me a lot was I heard about a helicopter crash. Interestingly, back in Kalispell, Montana, we're back to the alert helicopter. And so I called their program, I called their chief flight nurse and said, you know, we've been through this out here in Seattle. And I imagine that if I can't find the resources that I need here in Seattle, that you probably don't have them in Kalispell, Montana. So if there's anything I can do, please call. Well, I got a call back shortly thereafter from the pilot, and it happened to be somebody that I went to high school with, of course, because in Montana it's 2 degrees of separation as opposed to the usual 6. But he was military, and he was the pilot, and I think that, not to say that pilots, you know, don't get PTSD and aren't affected, but there's a difference between when you're in control and when you're riding along and you're not in control. I think that impacts people differently. And then a few weeks later, I got a call back from a flight nurse, And I pick up the phone and she says, hi, my name's Megan, and I was in that crash with alert. And she goes, you know, I thought I was okay, but I'm not. And so she sort of started to describe the roller coaster that she'd been on. I was like, wow, this is really similar to the roller coaster that I've been on. Maybe this is not just me. And so we sort of kept in touch and compared each other's, compared journeys and tried to support each other. And then there was another helicopter crash in Kansas about a year later, which is where Maggie got her EMS and nursing training. So she paid it forward, and she called their program and said, been through this, we need anything, call. Well, Teresa Pearson calls her back, same thing. I thought it was okay, but I'm not. So the three of us got on a conference call, and we were like, oh my gosh, maybe even though the crashes were really different, fallout was very similar. We're like, maybe this is something that really needs to be looked at. So we decided to go speak at AMTC, and that's where we met Jonathan. And we all sat down, we compared stories, and we were like, oh, we got to form a group. And so we initially called it the Survivors Club, and then we got, no, that's too exclusive. And so we expanded to the Survivors Network. And so we've been kind of growing and talking to people and kind of picking up more survivors in our snowball and learning a lot more about what people go through. And it's been an opportunity to bring the voices of survivors to these types of conversations because we haven't had that in the history of the industry, which is very interesting to me. And I think, people thought that helicopter crashes are not survivable, when in reality they are. And if you look at all of these different accidents, there was at least one survivor in all of these crashes, which is hard to believe considering the damage and destruction in some of them. So we had an opportunity to talk to all those people. Right now,
Yep.
right now in the HEMS industry, since the beginning of the industry in the early 1970s, there are now 376 fatalities that we know. And that's from the board of the Air Medical Memorial. So when we were doing our research, we asked Dr. Bloomman, okay, we know that there's this many fatalities, but how many survivors are there of incidents and accidents that are significant enough to warrant an NTSB number since the early 70s? His answer in 2010 was 586. So I kind of flashed back to standing next to the helicopter, the wreckage of the helicopter, trying to figure out, who I could talk to get some guidance on how to go through this, thinking there was nobody, and come to find out there are hundreds of people who have had similar experiences. So where's all the information? Where's all the data? What happened to them? What were their patterns of injury? What happened to their families? Where are the best practices on how to respond to these people, these human beings that are helping other people every day? Now, when you add up those numbers, there's enough people to fill up 2 or 3 747s. But because this is I think because this has happened incrementally, this buildup of people that have been directly impacted by accidents has been sort of insidious. But now we know. So my own personal theory on survivor outcomes is this. They fall somewhere on a bell curve. Some of them return to flying. Some take time off and return to flying. Some of them leave and are able to be employed elsewhere. But then there's the back half of the curve. People that are disabled physically and or psychologically. PTSD can be completely debilitating. People lose their jobs, their homes, their relationships. They become isolated. PTSD and addiction go hand in hand. They become despondent. And then, in the end, commit suicide. Now, if you follow the secret list, or if you follow the Code Green campaign, or any of those different Facebook pages or websites, you know that suicide is a terrible problem in EMS. Exclusive of incidents and accidents, it's just a terrible problem in EMS. So that's something that we really need to start paying attention to. I don't know what the skew is on this curve because there's no data available. And my personal hypothesis is that the back half of that bell curve is largely due to unidentified, unmitigated post-traumatic stress and traumatic grief. It's a very difficult way to lose people in a helicopter crash. After we talked to people for a while, we really realized that we need to broaden our definition of what a survivor is. Survivor is not just the person that is extricated from the aircraft. You have people in the accident, in the incident. You have friends and families, you have your mechanics. The very first memorial service I went to for Airlift 1 in 1995, there was a man sitting behind me sobbing. And I said to my friend, I said, who is that? Is that one of the family members? They said, no, that's the mechanic. I said, pilots, hospital staff. I think about the hospital staff that came running down, running out after our helicopter crash to St. Pete's. I think about that. The coroner in some of these small communities who have to go out and collect human remains. Law enforcement, investigators, administrators, communication specialists. You know, the communication specialist that was on for our crash was the same communication specialist that was on for the fatal crash a month before. They get left out. So, you know, as we've been moving forward with our efforts, I can't help but look at this picture and go, you know, okay, maybe it hasn't been intentional that we just stick these accidents in a box and put them away without really looking into the root cause and really looking into what happens to the people, the humans in the aircraft and their families. Maybe it's the fact that we fixate on the NTSB report that says the pilot made a mistake. And maybe we misuse those NTSB reports and say, well, then he's fired if he wasn't killed in the accident, and now we're good. I don't know what it is, but it disturbs me that this industry has been in existence for, you know, essentially 40 years with no information on these fatalities that have been happening for 40 years, and these are cerebral accidents. So we need to rethink the way that we're looking at things and examine these incidents and accidents closely through the lens of a just culture. Now, just culture, as I understand it, says that humans are hardwired to make mistakes. Accept it. If you accept that and you build a system around it that prevents those mistakes from becoming catastrophic. So it also says that, you know, when errors happen, it's an individual or a system problem, usually a combination of both. If it's an individual problem, you look at that individual and you say, was it human error? Could any of us have done that? Was it because somebody was taking a shortcut, number 2, and got burned? Or number 3 is because somebody was out and out reckless? Well, how you manage those things, how you manage an error depends on which one or more of those categories it was. It's an environment of learning. It's not an environment of punishment, because if you're afraid of being punished, like as was mentioned earlier, you're not going to report near misses, and then we have to wait until something becomes catastrophic to actually do something about it. If you go back to my accident, we're in a brand new aircraft. It has 2 engines. My pilot had nearly 8,000 hours, like I said, in helicopters. He had 15 hours in this helicopter. And what he had done was he lifted with 1 engine in idle. Well, there's a couple components to that. Human error. You know, he was a good guy. He was a very conscientious pilot, and he was, you know, a professional pilot. But according to the NTSB report, he didn't use his checklist. So human error and a shortcut. If he's only got 15 hours in this aircraft, I have to also question his criminal. And if you read the NTSB report, it validates that. It says there were inconsistencies in the startup procedure in his training, and that he says himself that he was never taught to identify and utilize the limit override switch, which I'm not sure if it would have made any difference in this accident. But he wasn't trained to respond to this emergency that he had created. So there's a human error issue, there's a training issue, and then there's the fact that this aircraft is allowed to pick up with 1 engine in idle without alarming. On the runway, no big deal. On a rooftop, big deal. All those different little bubbles on the Adams database, this had happened multiple times across the country in different programs. This accident was completely and totally preventable. pilot was fired. We called it good. That's another reason that I love the program. What kind of a just culture is that? And this was kind of before just culture had become a topic in HEMS. And I didn't know about it at the time. So now that I've learned about it and I feel like I understand better, I realize that's what I was looking for at the time, was a just culture. By the way, the pilot was hired in another flight program that flew the aircraft that he had flown previously, finished out his career, retired, incident accident. So by looking at these through the lens of a just culture, we can pull the lessons out so that we can prevent these same accidents from happening again. And it's to learn so that people like you don't have to go through it. The lessons are many. We just got a research study published in the Journal of Pre-Hospital Emergency Care. There are many, many lessons in each of these categories that we pulled out. For example, with the accident rate being what it is in this industry, do you have a will? Do you have life insurance that covers you while you're in a helicopter? Do you have disability insurance? People think a lot about, maybe think a lot, people think about being in a helicopter accident and not surviving. But you think about surviving. What are you going to do if you can't work? What are you going to do if you're burned, or you're in chronic pain, or you're missing a limb? These are very real things that come out of these types of accidents. Things to think about. I mean, and then along with managing risk and the practical aspects. Jonathan told you, put your visors down. We have one of our digital safety stories is by Tim Morse, who they're flying along and ran square into a flock of snow geese. And if you see the pictures, they're in the rotor disc, they're through the windscreen, they're stuck in the nose, and they had to make an emergency landing in order to get on the ground safely. How are you going to predict that? Visors down. Every survivor that I've spoken with wants two things. One is to be restored to a state where they can either continue their life's purpose of helping other people, or they can at least not be a burden on others. And they want to know that it's not going to happen again. I love and respect the people that I work with. I would never want them or you to go through what I've been through or what Jonathan's been through or any of our other survivors. So we go back to our original premise here, and I would add a comprehensive and proactive response plan, and that means being ready for an incident or accident. This is from the Asiana accident. Jim Goldman said, operate under the assumption of when, not if. And if that doesn't make you uncomfortable, I don't know what will. But it's a reality. And guess what? It's a reality of life in general. Look at the people that we take care of every day. They're in the prime of their life, walking down the street when the proverbial grand piano falls on their head. We just happen to be in an industry where our risk is a little bit higher. So we have an opportunity to recognize that and to prepare accordingly. And I promise you, it won't make it easy, but it'll make it a lot easier than what people who don't have those things in place ahead of time are having to go through. Somebody asked me one time, how will we know when we're safe, when our program is safe? And I said, you'll probably know when you get to the point where you stop asking that question, because you recognize that those holes in the Swiss cheese are always moving. So you're always in pursuit of predicting where those holes are going to move. And they're always moving. There are always going to be variables that sometimes are unpredictable. What's one of the latest ones? Drones, right? We have to work with the drone industry to help them understand that they're a threat to our medical helicopters and helicopters in general. So that those lines in Swiss, the holes in Swiss cheese don't line up and create a hazard. There you go, now they're moving. How could you ever say that you're safe when you're chasing all those goals? You know, it's a relentless pursuit of Vision Zero, relentless pursuit. But at the same time, don't be naive. You have to be prepared for an accident. So I don't expect you to read this, but this is from the International Civil Aviation Organization. And they are saying assistance to person involved in aircraft accidents is an indisputable humanitarian duty. And they're talking about commercial jet crashes. I would argue that it's the same in this industry. A proven plan is critical to the provision of family and survivor assistance because the need to provide such assistance will occur with little or no warning, will require an immediate response, and will involve large numbers of trained personnel, significant expense, and use of resources. Take a step back and ask yourself that uncomfortable question. Are you ready? Are you ready personally? Are you ready professionally? Are you ready as a program? And are we ready as an industry to help manage these folks? This is just to remind you that it's not just helicopters. I focus on helicopters because that's what I know the most and that's my personal experience, but we certainly include fixed wing, ground, marine, all those different modes of EMS transportation because the principles are largely the same. The Air Medical Memorial and National EMS Memorial Services take place annually now. So if anything happens to you, then we're probably going to meet your families. So I would follow these things on, they're on social media, on Facebook. Understand what they're about, understand what services are available, and be a part of creating a plan that will help sustain our people and their families should the unthinkable happen. So the Survivors Network is about risk mitigation, preparation, response, and recovery, bringing those voices of the families and the survivors to the table, to the conversation. We've been busy. We've got lots of projects. We have a Facebook page. It's called the Survivors Network for Air and Surface Medical Transport. Please check it out. It's not all about accidents. We post like inspirational things as well. How to be prepared, news articles, things that are relevant to safety and survival. If you have a chance to check out the digital safety stories, the Center for Medical Transport Research has them, and please feel free to participate. It's a wonderful opportunity to tell a story. It doesn't have to be a crash. If there's a lesson that you want to bring to the industry that'll help make people safer, please consider participating in that workshop. I'll leave you with a couple thoughts. There are no types of air crashes, only people with short memories, or people who naively just look at the accidents that have happened, draw a brief conclusion and move on. We need to look at those more closely. And again, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, which is what we've been doing. The butterfly effect is a small change in initial conditions can greatly impact an outcome. If you speak up, if you are financially prepared if something happens, what are you going to leave your family with? There are so many different things that they're seemingly little that they make a tremendous difference in the end. And all of that is because you guys matter. You are valuable people, and we want to keep you alive and safe and healthy and keep you and your families from going through what a lot of our other survivors have gone through. So, thank you for your attention. Does anybody have any questions? I know that that's a ton of content.